Hello everybody, and welcome to our first episode of the podcast. My name's Lynn. I'm your host. Today, I am so thankful to have as our first guest Keti Shea. She is a 39-year-old female who is been diagnosed with autism and ADHD, and I'm going to let her tell more of her story, but she is a lawyer and a writer who lives in Colorado. She has a daughter named Eloise, who's 6 years old, and a husband named Carl, who's a stay-at-home dad. They've been married since 2017. And I think this is going to be a really awesome conversation for anyone out there who is curious as to whether they might be neurodivergent, wants to hear stories of how other people found out that they were neurodivergent, parenting neurodivergent children, kind of all those things. So if you're interested in any of that, please stick around, and welcome our first guest, Keti. Hi.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. So I just want you to kind of start wherever feels organic to you, in kind of telling us your story of kind of how you discovered your own neurodivergence first, and then maybe we can talk about your daughter too.
Okay.
I'm sure it'll intertwine,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah,
totally.
yeah.
So I will say I always knew I was different, right? And for many years as a kid, I thought I was an alien. And then for many years after that, I thought I was schizophrenic. And partly that's because my family would call me names and call me schizophrenic and schizoid and freak and all of these names because I was very intense and I had very intense interests. I was labeled gifted as a child, and I did have at least one teacher in the early years, and then definitely by college and grad school, people were mentioning, they would kind of offhandedly say, "Oh, you have an exceptional brain because you're gifted, because you're high IQ." And I did undergo IQ tests and get, very, very high scores. And so I always kind of intuited from that and understood from that that I was different because I have a high IQ, which means that I have a harder time relating to people. But that always felt like very insufficient and inadequate because I do have a high IQ, but I know a lot of people that have a high IQ that are very brilliant people and have very active social lives. They don't seem to have these like rampant anxiety levels and this like intense feeling of isolation and loneliness. Like it was just something was missing. I went through a very difficult period in law school where I think I had a flare up of OCD-like symptoms, and I was diagnosed with OCD. I'm not sure if that diagnosis is still valid or if that was just the autism
Right.
really showing up because I was so anxious in law school. And it was just a very difficult setting because it's the Socratic methods. You're called on in front of a bunch of different people and put on the spot. It was just an autistic nightmare, right? Like
Yes.
it was a nightmare, but I felt like I had to do it because my family wanted me to go to law school and I felt like it was responsible and it would, I think at the time, it was part of my mask. Like, if I do something like this, no one will ever question me and see me as unprofessional because here I am in this thing. And even to this day, when I say lawyer, people have a kind of reaction like, wow, you must be very successful. And so I think I went to law school even though I was miserable the entire time because I wanted to have that professional patina and prove to people that I was not schizophrenic or a freak or a total weirdo. Um, but I struggled immensely and I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. I had a very dysfunctional, chaotic, abusive childhood, um, partly because I think I was undiagnosed neurodivergent and everyone in my family just kind of criticized the neurodivergent traits. And I only realized that in hindsight. In childhood, I just thought it was something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. I can't sit still. I can't concentrate on things I should be able to concentrate on. I was brilliant in some subjects, but could never pass a single math class to save my life. Um, and I realized at a very young age, I just thought differently and I conceived of things differently. Um, and I experienced synesthesia, the kind of blending of the senses. And so that
Can
was
you
one of the
explain that for kind of some people who might not know what that is?
Yeah, so I associate, so there's different types of it, right? I associate numbers with colors, with sounds, sometimes with smells. And as a kid, I would have I would have dreams about numbers. And in those dreams, I would actually visualize the numbers and it was associated with colors. And so I often, as I'm writing as well, will blend the senses. And so I'll talk about like being able to smell a sound because in my mind it's all kind of they're all linked.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one thing that I think my family, my mother in particular, noted when I was younger and kind of vilified me for it because they're like, wow, this is really weird. And so
I'm going to ask you a quick question. Looking back, do
yeah,
you see any neurodivergent traits in your family of origin?
yes,
Yeah.
all of them. I think some of them have different flavors of it, different combinations of it. Some of it is more ADHD, more pronounced ADHD, more pronounced autism. But I absolutely see nearly every member of my family having some form of neurodivergence.
Yeah.
And I do think part of the abuse and the trauma was, especially with my mother, because we look very similar. We act very similar. I have no doubt that she is AuDHD as well, and probably suffering from trauma from growing up in a household just like me and not having any treatment and any support for that. And so, yes, I see them as very much all neurodivergent. And I think a lot of it was them pushing it back against me because they recognize the same traits in themselves, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so absolutely, looking back now, I see them all as being neurodivergent and undiagnosed still to this day.
Yeah. Do they, well, I'm going ahead. I'm going way ahead. So you got through law school. When did you meet your now husband?
I met him in 2015, and that's when there was a huge shift for me because up until that point, I'd been kind of justifying the way I was living, masking, and I knew I was performing socially because I would come home from social events, even from like work events, just a day in the office, completely exhausted and drained and anxious, but also with physical symptoms as well, like headaches. I knew that synthetic fragrance was going to give me a migraine. And so, like, sharing an office was challenging because I would have to smell people's detergent, people's shampoo, people's perfume, the body sprays. And by the end of the workday, I was exhausted. And that always confused me and frustrated me because it was like, why can I be so smart in some ways, but I cannot get through a day without feeling like I need to lie down? I have a headache, I have a stomach ache, my whole body is very tense, I'm tired by 2 p.m. And so I started to notice as I entered the workforce that I was just not able to keep up or match other people's energy levels. Um, and I would talk to doctors, I talked to friends, and I think the consensus was, oh, you're just really anxious, or, you have PTSD. This is just trauma, it's anxiety, it's female hormones, it's your period,
Mm-hmm.
it's common dismissive things that women get told when they go with complaints to see a medical professional. And so, in my mind, if you read the symptoms or the symptoms of complex PTSD and you compare them to autism, there's tremendous overlap. And so I think I was getting closer, right, with the complex PTSD diagnosis and the OCD. They were pointing at the right things, but I could still sense that something was missing because there are just certain things I couldn't do. Like I can't read a map. I'm terrible at directions. Like that is not trauma, right? That is
Mm-hmm.
just the fact that my brain isn't wired for that skill set. Um,
I have
and
to
I've
ask, how are you with facial recognition? Because for me, I cannot recognize people's faces for the life of me. Like I'll meet them
yeah,
once and I'm not.
really so like
Yes.
I have a very freakish memory too for people's faces.
Oh,
Um, and so like I can remember names and faces very, very well.
okay.
And yeah, and I don't know if that's so therapists have suggested that's a sign of hypervigilance because I was always watching adults when I was younger to kind of understand their facial expressions. So
Right, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been very interested in human nature and human psychology. And I think part of my now I see it as a special interest in studying people and studying why people do the things that they do. So for that reason, I think I am actually very good at facial recognition, um, just because I've always been fascinated by people and what motivates them and things like that.
Yeah. So, when were your first signs, I guess, speeding up a little bit to more present day? When were your first inklings that there might be neurodivergence there? Like, when was the first time you thought, oh, this could be the missing puzzle piece?
Well, what's so funny is I was diagnosed as OCD, and I know that, which is a form of neurodivergence, and
Right.
I know that complex PTSD is acquired neurodivergence. I was diagnosed with those things, but no one ever explained what that was. It was just like, here you go, here's your diagnosis. Do you want some drugs? Um, and let's manage your anxiety. There was never a conversation of like, okay, so you're actually neurodivergent. And because you're neurodivergent, these may be things you struggle with. These may be things you're good at. How can we work to support you? I did not understand that being OCD or that a diagnosis of PTSD meant that I was neurodivergent. And I didn't even know what neurodivergent was.
And
Obviously, I knew the term. I have friends that are neurodivergent, but we had never spoken about the lived experience of it. So I didn't actually know what it meant. And I was just thought I was socially anxious, right? And had, periods of depression, periods of anxiety, periods where I was just overcome by trauma and trauma responses. And it wasn't until after my daughter was born and I noticed she was different from other babies. And it wasn't a bad thing. It was just she was notably different from other babies, other toddlers. And as she got older, those differences became more and more and more apparent. Like she talked later, she was very expressive with her body and her facial expressions, but was hesitant to use words in a way that made perfect sense to me. But then when I would watch her with her peers or their cohorts, I was like, oh, this is not how other babies her age are acting.
mhm.
Um, and she had a lot of difficulty sleeping. She was very, very, very strongly attached to having like a physical presence day and night. And so I was so touched out and so exhausted by that experience that I kind of turned to some parenting books and parenting blogs and podcasts, and nothing quite described her behavior, right? So it was like descriptions of spirited children. And I was like, well, she is spirited, but she also knows how to be very reserved when she needs to be. Like she acts very appropriate in public. Um, and I noticed a difference in her public persona versus her private behavior. She was almost like a different child. And she never broke character in public, and still to this day she doesn't. And so I finally found the highly sensitive child book that's pretty, ubiquitous in parenting circles, and that got close. There were times in that book where I was like, okay, that is her, but then there was other sections or relevant passages. I was like, that's not her at all. And so it wasn't honestly till I started using Instagram and I started seeing videos from AuDHD content creators, and they were posting memes, these little sound bites, and it would just show up in my explore page. And I would look at them and I would think, wow, this is such a funny, spot on video of my daily existence. And then I'd look at the hashtags and it would be like actually autistic or AuDHD. And I had to do like a double take. And I was like, wait, what? This is an autism joke that I get? Like, what?
Yeah.
Um, and then once that kind of light bulb went off, because the videos were just so spot on with my sense of humor and like my experiences working in a workplace and feeling like I'm the only one who's looking at all the pieces and everyone else is just like off here doing their own thing that makes no sense. Um, I started researching and found that autism and ADHD in girls and women looks very different from the stereotypes that we've all been kind of fed in the media. And once I discovered that, I just went down a rabbit hole of research because it was the first thing that ever explained my daughter's behavior in a way that made sense and explained all of it in just her as a whole person, right? It wasn't just like she does this because of this and this because of this. It's all just neurodivergence presenting in her as a unique child, right? And then as soon as I did that, as soon as I, understood her neurodivergence. And immediately I was like, oh, well, of course I am as well. Like whatever she is, I am, because we were just, her behaviors as a child and as a baby mimicked mine so closely. Like obviously we have some differences in her temperament and stuff, but the similarities were so striking. Um, and then just for my own peace of mind, I went to see a therapist that specializes in complex PTSD and neurodiversity in couples. And we did several sessions as a couple to help with my husband and I with communication. And then also just I met with her separately, and she, at the time, I was like, I think I'm autistic. And she said, not only are you autistic, but you have pretty obvious ADHD. And that's why probably you never got diagnosed, because you toggle back and forth between the two as well. And so it looks different. And that was something I'd always been confused by, because, I have autistic friends and they are way more reserved than I am. Like I'm able to socialize. It's just very exhausting to me, but I'm able to do it. I like doing it. And then at the same time, I have friends that are ADHD and they seem very chaotic to me. They cycle through hobbies. I'm like, I don't do that.
They don't need the routine as much as you do.
Correct. And so
Yeah.
and then the pieces started to fall into place, that it's the autism plus the ADHD to combine together to create this kind of like hybrid form of neurodivergence that doesn't always look like one or the other. It's this kind of third
Mishmash
combination thing. Right.
Yeah.
And it's with time. There are periods of the day where I feel a little bit more ADHD, and then periods of the day where I'm a little bit more withdrawn and autistic. And it also changes, like from within the week, within the month, for example. But that's kind of how I got to the end diagnosis. And then from there, I started writing about it and talking to other people like me, and realizing that a lot of the things that I struggled with and that I thought were personal challenges that were, specific to me, all of these other women have had very, very, very similar experiences with.
It's amazing
Yeah.
how many women specifically, or women identifying individuals, like discover the neurodivergence through their children. It was something that was not on my radar. I'll tell you, like, just a little bit about my story. Is it was not on my radar going into having a child. I had mental health disorders as a child too. I had complex PTSD. I had OCD, but neurodivergence, was not on my radar. And so, and only in looking back did I notice, oh, I did feel different. Oh, I did have trouble making friends. Oh, I was always stressed in friendship relationships, but like for me at the time, it was like I was just called sensitive, or I was, my sensory was a really big deal for me as a child. So I was very sensory avoidant and stuff like that. But again, it was just always called weird, or, too sensitive was the big one. And so, yeah, it wasn't on my radar until, again, just like you, I got on Instagram looking for my son, because I knew from birth almost that my son as well something was different with my son. He was inconsolable, all these things. And, all the doctors and all the professionals chalked it up to colic or this or that, or he ended up having, acid reflux. And they said, well, it's just the acid reflux. And I was like, no, there's more going on. There's something bigger here. So in going to social media, unfortunately or fortunately, to help diagnose my son, just like you, and kind of my like For You page, I saw all these moms of autistic individuals posting about themselves discovering their neurodivergence through their children, and then like relating to these jokes or these little slices of their life about, oh, this is, my social anxiety is really high, or I'm so tired, I just had a work outing, or, all these different things. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then the light bulb went off. And I think it's, I guess, a blessing and a curse that it had to be through social media that we all have to find out about our neurodivergence and about our kind of true identities. Obviously, mental health has not caught up with where we need to be in any way, shape, or form. And so I always think it's just astounding how so many of us came to this diagnosis through social media, through Instagram,
Hmm.
through just a kind of shared community of like shared experiences and that kind of thing. So it's just really interesting to hear that you came very
Hmm.
similar to me. And I think a lot of women and a lot of parents come to it that way too. Um, what were your first clues? Actually, I want to ask you, how was pregnancy and postpartum for you?
Very difficult.
Same. Yeah.
Yeah. Very difficult. I think, and I am a very sensitive person. That is the one insult that has been consistently lobbed at me, not just from family, but from people I've dated, lived with. And I'm just very finicky. And it's my emotional state, my moods, my nervous system, but it's also with food, it's with textures. Like I'm very, very particular about clothing. I had to cut my hair short because I don't like the way it touches
Mhm.
my neck. Everything was itchy as a child, and I still kind of feel that way today. Um, so I think the sensitivity was always, sorry, what was the question?
Just how was pregnancy and postpartum for
Oh, right,
you?
right, right.
Yeah.
The sensitivity was like times 100 during pregnancy. And I felt like I had these food aversions. I was obviously very hungry, but I couldn't eat. Like I couldn't find things to eat. I didn't know what I wanted to eat. All clothing irritated my skin, and everything was just like hypersensitive. And I think, when you're pregnant, people, come up to you and invade your personal space more. And I just felt like this trapped animal. Like I felt claustrophobic in my body. And I think the loss of control as your stomach's growing and you can't
Yes.
move in the same way felt very terrifying. And then I felt guilty for feeling that way because I felt like, am I being vain? Am I being superficial? Like it's just, this is pregnancy. I'm supposed to be good at it. I'm supposed to love this. I'm a woman. But I just felt like my body had been hijacked, and all of the sensitivities that I already struggle with tremendously and were contributing to high levels of anxiety, were ratcheted up, right?
Yep.
Because of the
Yep.
pregnancy hormones and just the discomfort of it. And so I was extremely nauseous the whole time. Um, I had some nerve pain in my right leg. I'm not a very big person, and so like the I think just the weight of the belly created some pressure on the
Hmm.
nerve in my right pain. And so I had this kind of like electrical pain in my right side, that was so uncomfortable, and I had trouble sleeping. So by the time I went to give birth, I was just so excited to just get this baby out and have a body again, right? And like to feel
Yes.
some sense of agency and control. And it was really frustrating because I would go to a doctor and be like, I'm really uncomfortable. And there was just nothing they can do because you can't take any medication when you're pregnant. Now we did do a home birth. And so I had my
Okay.
daughter at home, unmedicated, and that was really great. I knew I wasn't going to be able to cope with the kind of sensory environment of a hospital. And so I opted for the home birth for that reason. And we were able to have her at home. And,
That's amazing.
yeah,
Because I think for me, the reason is we had a hospital birth, and I would have loved, I think, a home birth for the sensory aspect, but the pain aspect was just
yeah,
unfathomable to me. And when I started to
yeah,
go into labor and had contractions and felt like the world was ending, I know I made the right choice because I don't
right.
think I could have done a home birth unmedicated. So that's amazing that you were able to do that. How do you feel like your pain tolerance is just generally?
You
Because I know
know,
sometimes it varies
yeah,
with people.
I think so I had a part of my childhood trauma was I had a lot of dental trauma where I went to the dentist, and I have this thing that I think is quite common in neurodivergent people, but also specifically people with red hair. There's some type of genetic component to this where your teeth don't get numb with Novocaine. And so I had a number of cavities like drilled on, filled by dentists as a child, and my teeth weren't numb. And they didn't
Oh,
believe me when I said they weren't
oh
numb,
no. Oh my
and
gosh.
it was extremely painful. And so like I had been through that like five, six, seven different times. I also did not have very good good genes for teeth. I just have
Yeah.
this kind of teeth that get cavities. And my parents weren't like the most vigilant about parenting in general. So I had a number of those really painful experiences. And I think I just learned to tolerate extreme amounts of pain because I thought it was normal and because everyone was telling me I was a baby and being too sensitive. And so I just thought I was very intolerant to pain and I needed to suck it up. And so for unmedicated childbirth, it worked out in my favor, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the pain during labor was truly horrific. And if it was my first pregnancy, my first labor, so I had nothing to compare it to.
Right.
And it was one of those things where the pain was horrific, but also me being in a hospital with people coming in and out and the sensory overwhelm of the sounds and the smells. I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know. If I had to do it again, I'm not sure what I would do.
Yeah.
Um,
And you bring up an interesting point of, especially with the kind of going back to your dental history, which is awful, the gaslighting that happens
mhm,
to, I don't know if you've experienced this in advocating for your daughter. I mean, let
mhm,
alone advocating for yourself, but, so I
mhm.
also have a neurodivergent son, and I think they're about a year apart, your daughter
Yeah.
and my son. And so, um, the gaslighting, I don't know if you've experienced this, but
Yes.
the medical gaslighting
Yes.
has been insane around, and I'll just to specify for people out there who might not understand, the gaslighting around, no, your child's not neurodivergent, no, there's
Hmm.
nothing wrong with your child, no, you're making it up, you're too sensitive, you're a first time mother, you don't have anything to
Hmm.
compare it to,
All of those things. Yeah.
you are anxious as a mother, so you're just making things up, and then let alone your own gaslighting history of when you're
Hmm.
in pain, people not believing you, or
Hmm.
when you go to see a doctor and you're like, no, I'm still feeling like crap, and
Yeah.
people just not wanting to look further into it.
Hmm.
Um, I think the gaslighting that a lot of neurodivergent individuals experience is, especially by the medical community, is something that I have found to be just like abysmal.
Hmm. Yeah, I have noticed with my daughter, with, when I go to tell people, like, oh, we can do this play date or we can do this activity, but we're going to need to modify it slightly because she doesn't do well in these situations, whatever it may be. Like, for example, she does go to school. She's not homeschooled. She goes to school, but a full day of school is a lot for her. And she needs to come home and she needs to debrief and she needs to change her clothes and she needs to play and she needs to go into her imaginary world. And so oftentimes I tell people and they look shocked when I say, like, we can't do a play date right after
Yeah.
school because that's too much for her. Like, she
Yes.
needs to come home and be in her home environment and completely begin debriefing.
Same.
If
Yep.
right, right. Like, and like
Mm-hmm.
if we want her to get to bed because her nervous system is ratcheted up at school, it's good for her to be there. It's good, education socially as well. Like, she needs to be around her peers, but at the end of the day, she needs to come home
Yeah.
because that's her limit. But other parents look at me and they're like, wait, what? Like, they don't, people do not believe me when I say she's neurodivergent because she presents as a lower support needs
Yes.
AuDHD
It sounds
girl.
like,
So
correct me
she's
if I'm wrong, that she's
social
good at
and, yeah,
masking.
very good at masking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she just learned to do it.
Yeah.
I think by like 4, she did go to preschool part-time. Like, we eased her into it very, very, very slowly. Um, And she was often called shy and quiet
Mm.
and reserved and all of these labels. And I noticed she started to get mad when people called her shy. And so I said, you can tell people you're not shy, you're just quiet, or you just like to observe before joining. And so I would kind of coach her and as she's going throughout the preschool experience. But I did notice she would mask. She would be completely frozen and silent in public, and then come home and just unleash all of her noise and all of her talking around just me and my husband. Even like FaceTiming with family, she'll go completely silent and like rigid, like a statue. It's like she
Yes.
doesn't know what to do
Yes.
and she will respond to prompts, but you can tell she is like, okay, I'm responding to a prompt right now because someone is asking me. Um,
The
and
second
so,
we turn
yes.
on a camera for
Oh, yes.
FaceTime or anything with a
Yeah.
grandparent, anyone he knows, doesn't, whatever. Yeah.
And is probably excited to talk to, but the
Yeah.
moment the
Yeah.
camera comes on, it's the frozen
Yeah.
mask. And right. Um, she did kindergarten twice. Her
Okay.
teacher noticed that, she has trouble speaking up and saying when she needs to go to the bathroom, talking to the teacher. She was just very, very, very reserved. And so she did kindergarten a second year, and that helped tremendously. And I have noticed this year she's not masking as much.
Oh, that's
But
great.
Yeah, so she comes home and she's a different child. Like there isn't that unleashing anymore. She's a little bit more consistent with integrating the kind of like her authentic self at home and the public self at school, which has been really nice to see. Last year, she came home and said things like, my brain is broken. I'm different. My mouth is different. I talk funny. And so like already at 5, she would have been just barely 5. Already at 5, I could see her in her brain being like, I'm different. Um, and there are people like me and there are people not like me. And she would ask me questions like, is this a funny thing to do that other people would think is funny? Or is this a funny thing to do only at home and other people will think it's weird? Like she was already at 5 navigating like how to be different in public for social acceptance.
Yeah.
So yes, she's
Have
definitely
you
high
guys,
masking.
yeah, have you had, this is something where, because my son's about to turn 5, and so, um, and was recently just officially diagnosed, even though I
Mm,
knew for a long
right.
time. But I feel like we got like the green light when we got
Hmm.
the, official diagnosis, which obviously you don't need that. But um, have you, how have you navigated talking to your daughter about her neurodivergence, if at all? I mean, do you
Yeah.
talk about her having a different brain, or do you guys talk about, or is it all like led by her? And how has that gone?
Yeah, so this is interesting because I had a meetup recently with other parents at her school. She goes to a Waldorf
Okay.
inspired charter school. So it's a public school, but it's definitely alternative. And they are very accommodating. They have spinny seats and fidget toys in the
Oh,
classroom,
great.
and it's everyone is automatically accommodated, no questions asked. It's been a great school environment and very, very unique, I think.
Yes.
Um, but at that meetup, there were other parents of neurodivergent kids who also, not surprisingly, were, some flavor of neurodivergence themselves. And so that question came up. And so we started talking about ways that all the people in the group had broached the topic. But it was one of those things where as parents, we all kind of looked around the room like, what are we supposed to do? And what do you say and when? We have started just now talking to her about it, and she's 6. So she turned 6 in June, the end of June. And I have started talking to her about it, but I usually make it about myself first. It's always through the lens of me instead of it making it about something with her, some kind of, I don't like to, pathologize or
Hmm.
label too much because I do think autism in particular is very stigmatizing.
Yes.
And misunderstood. ADHD as well, but like especially autism. And then when you're both, people are like, what is that?
Yeah.
Um, and so I have started talking to her about it just very casually, because she asks a lot of questions, like a lot of autistic kids or ADHD kids. She just follows me around a lot and asks
Hmm.
questions. And she'll ask me why I do certain things, or um, I would say about 6 months ago, she started asking me, why aren't you like the other moms? And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, you look different and you act different and you talk different. You're not like the other moms. And so I didn't read too much into it, but I just use that as an opportunity to be like, oh, well, my brain works this way. I don't use labels. I didn't say neurodivergent. I don't use
Hmm.
autism or ADHD because I feel like that's just going to be too confusing
Yeah.
for her. Um, and it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
But I just started talking about what it's like to be neurodivergent without using any of the actual labels. And I was like, because you're my daughter, you probably can relate to some of these things as well. And but you're also your own person, so you're gonna have to figure out what your skills are and what your challenges are. And that's just one thing about being human is that everybody has something that they're really good at and some things that they're working on. And you and me are kind of more similar in that we're really good at this. We're really good at creativity, really good at pattern recognition, noticing things that other people don't see. We're really good at our imaginations and world building, but we struggle in certain other areas. Like I struggle to make new friends and keep new friends. I sometimes feel shy in new places or in different places. I like to have my routine. And so I just talked about it like that. Because I think it's just a more natural, organic conversation. And I think as she gets older, I will introduce terms like neurodivergent, which is just a very umbrella term.
Hmm.
Um, and then as she gets older, I will tell her, about autism and ADHD specifically.
Yeah. Another question I had about parenting for you is how have you managed, or what does it look like for you to manage your sensory needs, sensory limitations, whatever, alongside your daughter's sensory limitations, sensory needs? I know for us, it's a constant kind of back and forth of like
Hmm.
who gets their sensory needs met. You know, is it
Yep.
my son or is it me? Do I take the five
Hmm.
minute break and tag out with my husband while
Yep.
I kind of go recoup so that I can come back to a baseline?
Yeah.
Um, how has it looked for you with parenting a neurodivergent child, being neurodivergent yourself, and having those, needs, I
Right.
guess?
I mean, I think in the beginning, when I was first kind of discovering all of this, I had that moment, and I'm sure you did, many, many people do, who kind of come to neurodivergence late in life. This notion of like, well, I'm not neurodivergent. I don't flap my hands. I don't stim. Like I don't stim. And then I would see my daughter do something that was very subtle, but was clearly a stim. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, wait, I do that. Like I do
Yeah.
that. And so there was these moments in like when she was much younger and I was first learning about this, where watching her do her sensory things, like avoiding a bath because she didn't want the water on her skin, but then refusing to get out of the bath because she didn't want the
Yes.
cold air to touch her, and then
Yes.
getting the towel on her, but the towel is scratchy, but then the towel can't come off because the cold air is, and just being so frustrated as a parent about these, like we would just get caught in all of these different areas where you just get stuck with your kid. And then my husband would turn to me and be like, you do that too. So I think in the beginning, I was kind of watching her and realizing and kind of coming to terms with how many sensory things I have that I had just kind of repressed
Mm-hmm.
and been like, no, that doesn't bother me. And not even like realizing how deeply impacted I am on a daily basis by the sensory challenges. So that was kind of the first phase. And then once I moved out of that phase and started kind of accommodating myself, wearing different clothing, cutting my hair, wearing minimal makeup because that the sensory ick of having makeup on my face was a big thing that I didn't even realize, right? And then once I started accommodating myself, I realized how many of those sensory challenges I had. But yes, now we're in a space, now that she's older and both of us kind of are more on stable footing with like, this is who I am, this is who she is. We oftentimes butt heads with
Yeah.
like sensory aversion versus sensory seeking. She has some sensory seeking behaviors that immediately set me on edge. Like there's just repetitive noises. She has a phrase that she's making that feels really good to her to say over and over again, very loudly. And she's having a great time and she's happy. And I hate it because I can hear it. And it's just
Yes.
the repetition. And so we'll do things like I wear loop earbuds at times
Yeah.
when she's just having a time where she needs to make noise. I have to, like, as a parent, it's tough because I want to accommodate myself, especially when I haven't done it for decades and decades and decades. And then all of a sudden you realize you can do this and you can make yourself feel better and regulate your nervous system that this way. There's that tendency to want to be like, no, it has to be my way all the time. But then I have to realize she's 6, she's having fun, this is good for her. And this is part of the dance, right? Like of living in a neurodivergent household is where you're
Yes.
constantly kind of accommodating yourself and one another and then negotiating the boundaries of that. Um, I mean, I'm really lucky that my husband stays home because I will tap out periodically. When I
Yeah.
get overwhelmed, it's just like I got to tap out. I got to
Yeah.
go to the other room for 30 minutes. I got to go for a walk and get outside. And then that clears it often. But I do wear loop earbuds
That's
um,
good.
a lot of the time. And I've just gotten used to wearing them. And it mutes everything for me and it lets her do her thing.
That's great. One before because I know we're starting to get close to time.
Hmm.
Another question I had for you, and this is kind of going back to your professional life.
Hmm.
Since kind of coming to the realization that you're neurodivergent, have you made any accommodations for yourself at work, and how has that looked? If has that been accepted at all? Is that,
Yeah.
because I know a lot of people struggle a lot with
Yeah.
trying to, once they come into this realization and start to realize they need those accommodations, like getting people
Hmm.
to accept them at work is
Yeah.
sometimes quite difficult.
Yeah. So I'm lucky in that I work from home and I work for the federal government. government. So, and I work for an agency that's very, very good at work-life balance. So I haven't come out fully to everyone at work because I do feel like it's one of those things where I use code words with different people and different social groups. So at work, because it is very professional, because I do work for the government, I don't come out and say I'm autistic. I have told my supervisor specifically that I have ADHD, and I'll say it, or I'll say I'm neurodivergent. So I will come out as neurodivergent, but that took, I mean, I've been in this workplace since I want to say it's been 10 years, and it wasn't till very recently that I felt confident to be like, to tell them that I'm neurodivergent.
Yeah.
And I don't word it as asking for accommodations, but I will say, this is my preference for work style. Like I tend not to do well with group projects, collaborative projects, but I work, I always word it as these are my skills and my assets if you want to make use of them. These are the things I'm challenged by. I'm happy to work in a way that needs to be done. Like I don't want to be not a team player. I don't, because I think in the back of my mind too, I'm constantly, even if I'm not masking, I'm aware of the stereotypes that people have about neurodivergent people, and I don't want to be that. I don't want to be seen as prickly and difficult and not a team player and aloof and like, emotionally unintelligent. So I will go out of my way to kind of present as friendly and approachable and amenable to all of these things. But there are times where I know I'm kind of approaching burnout, for example, or I know a project is just going to stress me out tremendously. And I will say, this is not my preference. And I've always been accommodated. No one's ever questioned me.
Oh, that's really amazing.
Yeah, but I think that's a rarity.
That's rare. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was my last job. I'm a therapist, kind of retired as of now, not working currently, but so a social worker, and I was working at a hospital, and full time and hospital social work is, it can be
Yeah, totally.
exhausting, especially for someone like me. And I did ask for accommodations once I got my official diagnosis. For better or for worse, I did tell them kind of, okay, this is what I was just diagnosed with. And my accommodations were met on deaf ears, and it eventually led to me having to just leave the workplace altogether. And so, I am very envious of people who have a good workplace that kind of you don't even need to tell them full details of, like what's going on with you.
Right.
You can just kind of say, these are my strengths, this is what I prefer, and they listen to you mostly. That's amazing. Yeah. And that kind of leads to my final question, one of my last two questions. How has your unmasking journey been so far? Because I know for me, I feel like that's where I'm at right now, is like this unmasking process of finding my new kind of identity in being able to say no to things and being able to say, oh, I'm not just sensitive, this is a need. And so that's been kind of where I'm at in my unmasking journey. And I know that I feel like relationships have been strained by that. Family members, friends might not always accept those things. So I'm curious how it's gone for you.
I mean, I think for me, so I should say I'm estranged from my family. I cut contact with my family 6 years ago, so I didn't have to kind of come out to them and navigate that with them, because we just we had minimal contact, and then I finally just did no contact. But with with my husband's family and friends, and just acquaintances as well, I kind of, it's a process, right? Like you don't just all of a sudden wake up one day and you're like, okay, I'm gonna unmask. I think it's more about the discovering how much I'm masking and camouflaging as I go, right? And so like, and then as I strip more and more and more of the layers away, I realize how much more there is. I think it was in the beginning very, very anxiety producing, because it felt very vulnerable, right? Like, especially as someone who is traumatized and been called slurs and names and gotten misdiagnoses that are very stigmatizing. there was this sense of like, like I can't do this. I don't want to be seen. Like I have a very, very strong fear of perception.
Mm-hmm.
Rejection sensitivity is very, 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 very strong. And the unmasking, I think, kind of has triggered that. But I view it as exposure therapy, right? So like I take small incremental steps to slowly unmask. And I do it based on my own comfort level, but I do push myself, right? And it's just this kind of like iterative form of exposure therapy where like I have to put myself out there in social situations, not relying on alcohol, not relying on, drugs or anything else. Like I'm just going to go out into the world and be myself. Um, and so I'll do things like trick myself. I'll be like, I'm going to go to this event in a new place that I've never been before. It's going to be, scary and new and different. I'm only going to go for 10 minutes and then I'm going to leave. And oftentimes I end up staying for more than 10 minutes. But I do things like that where I kind of like push myself. I'll give myself a benchmark or a milestone to meet. Um, and then at the same time, I allow myself to kind of retreat into my shell sometimes. Like it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to be all the time. Like there are just times where I feel like I need a mask right now. I need to be accepted socially. I just
Yeah.
can't handle the like putting myself out there and watching people's facial expressions go up in a jumble because they don't understand me and they think I'm weird, which happens, right? Like there is some rejection that comes with unmasking. And that's, I think, challenging when your whole life you've been subtly or not so subtly excluded from things. And that like pain that lives with you when you're the one that doesn't have anyone to sit with at lunch, or people think you're weird and they call you a freak. And so now, it's that putting yourself out there, realizing not everyone's going to like that and accept that, and just doing it anyway.
Yeah.
Um, and there have been friend mix-ups. Like I have lost friends, I've lost touch with friends. But then there's also people that kind of come out of the woodwork that I haven't spoken to in years, who see what I post on social media or they read the things I write that are about neurodivergence. And they're like, I'm not neurodivergent, but like this really resonates with me. Or they don't resonate with it, but they reach out and they're like, I really like what you're doing. I like this authentic you. So it's both. It's like it's a reshuffling, right? Like I'm losing people, but I'm also gaining people as well.
Yeah.
Um, which
That's
I think naturally happens as we age too, right?
yes.
Like we
Yeah.
kind of just grow out of friendships, we grow out of
Right.
relationships.
This sometimes I think just kind of perpetuates that a little faster.
Yes, this makes it more intense, right?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
You mentioned your writing. I want to tell people where they can find you. I think you said on Substack you have some
Substack.
essays.
Yeah, I have essays on Substack. Just it's just my name, Keti Shea, and then also on Instagram, same thing, Keti Shea.
Keti Shea. And that's
Yeah, and I
Ketishea.
post. Mhm. Yep, correct.
Perfect.
And I post all my writing there. So
Perfect. So people can find you and find writing that may resonate with them and their experience. Last thing I want to ask you is what would you tell someone who might be listening to this, who's at the kind of beginning stages of where you
mhm.
were and where I was in the beginning of kind of not knowing what's exactly going on with you?
Mhm.
What's maybe something you wish you would have known at that point, or just any words of wisdom for someone going through kind of the beginning stages of the process?
I would say be kind to yourself and be open-minded. I think one of the things I realized going through this is how much ableism I've internalized, right? And how much I've been discriminated against because of my brain. And I didn't even realize it. I knew something was happening, right? I knew I was being rejected. I knew I was being excluded. I knew I was being overlooked in certain situations where I'm like, wait, why is this person getting this promotion and not me? Um, why can't I, thrive in a conversation the way other people seem to do, or in social situations or in friendships? Why is that so unnatural to me? I would say be kind to yourself and be open-minded, and give yourself grace, because there is this period of like realizing how much internalized ableism we all carry. Because I think somewhere in our bodies as kids, we internalize this thing that we're different and that we're weird and there's something wrong with us. And then as a result, we try to push ourselves away from anything that is different and weird. and wrong. And for that reason, I think for many years I didn't like associate disability with something that applied to me, right? Like I know invisible disabilities exist. I believe in
Mm-hmm.
invisible disabilities, but it was not something that applied to me.
Yeah.
And so I think there's this period of like reckoning where you have to let the ableism go, and you also have to recognize um, that you may take on a new persona that feels uncomfortable, and it's okay. And know that like a lot of the things that we grow up thinking are bad and wrong are just traits of neurodivergence, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
it's totally okay um, to kind of let go of the shame, because I think there's so much shame around it. And it's a process, right? It's almost like a
Yeah.
grieving process where it's like, oh my God, I've been doing this thing for years. For me, it was like 35, 36, 37 years. I've been acting like a person that is not authentic to me.
Yeah.
And isn't that sad, right? And so like there's this grieving process and there's anger, and just you just have to kind of go through it and accept it and not resist it. Because on the other side of that, you meet really cool, smart, funny people that are like you.
Yes.
Um,
There's a whole
and so it's
community.
super rewarding.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But just, it's a sad process at times too. We have to
Yeah.
kind of let go and be like, oh my God, people have been treating me badly my whole life,
Yeah.
and I didn't know why.
Yeah. And it's kind of an isolating
Crazy.
process, I think,
It
too.
is, yeah.
Yeah. Especially if you're a new mom going
Oh
through it.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
some of the most isolating times, I think. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would echo be kind. Be kind to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Go easy. Take it slow. And
Right.
if you have an inkling, if you have a little intuition that something's going on, do your
You're probably
research.
right.
You're probably right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much. It was so wonderful meeting you and talking to you. And I'm so
Yeah, you
thankful
too.
that you were my first guest. And I wish you and your family nothing but the best. And I hope we keep in touch.
Thank you. Good luck with the podcast, and thanks for
Thank
having me
you.
on.
Thank you so much.